it's Maya here, and this is my June wrap-up. In June I read 5 books or novellas and I gave all of them 4 stars, so it was a pretty good reading month. I also read 6 graphic novels, which varied from 2 to 5 stars, so some of them were quite good, some of them less so. Let's get right into the books. The first book that I read was Between Two Thorns by Emma Newman. This is the first in the Split Worlds series. This is sort of a mix between urban fantasy and fantasy of manners. In this there are at least 3 different worlds. Our world, the world of the mundane, and a magical mirror world that sort of echoes our own world but with magic, and the Fae world. And the magical mirror world is quite backwards in its more settling somewhere between Regency and Victorian, I think. One of the main characters is Kathy, who has escaped from the magical otherworld to live more freely in our modern world. And another character is an investigator called Max, who is an arbiter, which is sort of a police officer that governs the use of magic in our mundane world. The book was fun and fast-paced, and I really enjoyed following especially the character of Kathy. Kathy was a great mix of strength and vulnerability, because sometimes you just can't do anything against magic. I was also really interested in the society of the magical otherworld, and I really do enjoy amoral, dangerous Fae characters, but on the other hand I wasn't that interested in Max's storyline. I look forward to reading more in the series. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's fun, and I do enjoy all the different elements. I gave this one 4 stars, and I will actually be reading the second book, Any Other Name, in August. Next I read Maurice by Ian Forster. In this we follow the main character Maurice Hall and his relationships through his Cambridge years and the start of his career. Most of the book focuses on the relationship between Maurice and his Cambridge friend Clive. Forster wrote this book in 1914, when homosexuality was of course very much a taboo, and it was only published after his death in 1971. Like in the other book that I've read from Forster, which is Room with a View, I really like the writing style. It was such a pleasure, it was so easy to read. The characters were frustrating at times. They were trying to find their place in the world and where they belonged and with whom, but I really did enjoy following their journey even through the more frustrating times. I felt like the latter part of the book could have been developed a little bit more for it to ring true for me, but this was a very good read nevertheless. I gave this one also 4 stars. Then is a book that I actually didn't rate, and this is Boy Meets Boy by David Levithan. This is a contemporary young adult romance that follows Paul, who falls in love with Noah, who is the new kid at school. The book is set in an interesting town of Levithan's own creation, in which cheerleaders ride motorcycles, and the homecoming queen and the star quarterback are the same person, called Infinite Darlene. I liked it okay when I was reading it, but like with most young adult romances, I missed some sort of connection with it. Young adult romances are not my regular thing, so I always struggle with what rating to give them, so most of the time I just end up not giving them a rating at all. Of course, if I had absolutely loved it, I would have given it 5 stars, but since I didn't, it's just sort of I don't know. Next I read a novella called Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. This is a novella about kids who have visited these magical otherworlds, Narnia style, but have had to return to our world. The main character is Nancy, and at the beginning she moves to Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children. It's a place for these sort of kids where they get to be themselves without being considered weird, and trying to learn to cope while also trying to find a doorway back to the world that they visited. Blame It on Narnia as a kid, I'm always been really interested in these stories of how people deal if they have to return from a magical world that they have visited, especially if they grew up in the world and then came back as kids. So of course the moment I heard about this story I wanted to read it. I was very into the writing style and the atmosphere, and I really loved learning about the kids and what sort of magical worlds they each had visited. The main plot was quite secondary to me. It's also nice to see an asexual main character, which you don't see that often, and all in all I enjoyed this novella and I gave it 4 stars. And the final book that I read in June was Flowers for Algernon by Danielle Keyes. This is a famous science fiction classic that started as a short story and the author then later turned it into a novel, which is the one that I read. The book tells of Charlie Gordon, whose IQ is 68, and he takes part in a scientific experiment that tries to make humans more intelligent. Charlie is the first human test subject after the procedure worked on a mouse called Algernon. I loved how the book was told through progress reports that Charlie wrote himself both before and after the operation, so you can see the shift in his intelligence levels. I liked some parts of the book more than I liked other parts. I liked how the book took a look into how people treat other people with different intelligence levels, and how Charlie personally learned to notice how people were treating him differently. I was also interested in his complicated relationship with the scientists who run the experiment. But on the other hand, I found there was too much of a focus on sexual relationships. I understand that they also had to be discussed, but I think that they were given too much importance for such a short book. I read this in one day. I stayed up until 4 a.m. to finish it because I felt like it was a story that worked better to read in one go. I gave it 4 stars for the interesting concepts it dealt with, although judging on my personal emotional connection, it was more like 3.5 stars. Now let's move on to the comics that I read. The first comic that I read was actually a reread for me. It was Umbrella Academy Volume 1 by Gerard Way and art by Gabriel. Now this is a superhero comic that's set in pretty much our world, but not quite. Like there are things like space squids and other quirky goings on that require superhero intervention. 7 exceptional kids were born with superpowers, and they were groomed to be heroes by this millionaire inventor, Reginald Hargreaves. And this comic starts when 6 of them come back together as adults after years of being off on their own. So like I said, this was a reread for me. I remember that on first read it felt a bit rushed. Like there wasn't enough time to dwell on most of the ideas for long enough for me to really grasp them. I learned too little about the characters and the world, and I felt like I could really grown to like the characters if I had been given something more to work with. So the first read through left me with a bit of an uncertain feeling, but on reread the storytelling felt a lot less jarred and rushed. I think there was only one scene that I felt wasn't told clearly enough. So I liked it better on reread. My favorite character was Seanan. I like how he floats around. He's sort of this very off-kilter presence, throwing comments from the back. And he also quite often looks like he just can't be bothered. Next I read the second volume called Dallas, and I didn't enjoy this nearly as much as the first one, perhaps because I have no interest in the Vietnam War or the assassination of President Kennedy as a setting. Some of the characters still feel a bit dull for me, a bit like archetypes like the silent leader, and I wished Rumor would have had more to do. But my favorite character is still Seanan. He brightens up scenes for me, and Hazel and Jar Jar were a delightfully disturbing addition. Like, so disturbing. So I gave the second volume only 2 stars. The next graphic novel that I read was The Nameless City by Faith Erin Hicks, and this is the first book in a new series. It follows Kaido, who is the main character, and he travels to a city that his country is currently ruling. And the original residents only call it the Nameless City, since it has been invaded so many times by so many different countries that always give it a new name. And the main focus is on Kaido and this street rat girl character called Rat. I found the story to be quite predictable, and I was left wanting more. It was very much a prologue, a quick story of how these kids met and became friends. And I could tell what was going to happen from pretty early on. The art style was fun and the colors bright, and I have seen Faith Erin Hicks' artwork before and I quite enjoy it. I think this comic could work very well for the target age group, the middle grade readers. Like I said, it was a bit too simplistic for me. It's a bit in the vein of Avatar in that these 2 kids from different cultures have an adventure in a fantasy city, with a look into how the invaders see themselves differently from how the people they invaded see them. Although it's not nearly as layered as Avatar. I gave this one 3 stars. And next is my favorite graphic novel that I read in June, and that is Baba Yaga's Assistant by Marika McCoola with illustrations by Emily Carroll. This is essentially a quite simplistic fairy tale, but it does what it does really well. The main character is Masha, who has to deal with her father getting remarried and she feels a bit abandoned. She sees an ad in the newspaper looking for an assistant to Baba Yaga and she decides to apply. But of course Masha has to go through some tests to qualify. I loved the different tests, and I also loved how the book quickly went through some older Baba Yaga stories that were colored more brightly than the rest of the book. Emily Carroll does a really good job with the art. I actually prefer her creepier art in her own stories a bit better, but this style works really well for this book. I really love the depiction of Baba Yaga, both art and writing wise, and I especially like the inside of Baba Yaga's hut with its blue tones. And I think this is a great comic book for kids, and it got 5 stars from me. Next I read Paper Girls, written by Brian K. Vaughan and illustrated by Cliff Chiang, and this is a science fiction comic about 12-year-old newspaper delivery girls in the late 80s. And the only thing I knew about this comic beforehand was that there are paper girls in it and that it gets weird. So I was expecting quite a wild ride, but in the end I wasn't feeling it. I'd heard good things, but I just couldn't get into it. I felt disconnected with the characters, and although much was going on, I didn't really care to find out more. I didn't have a huge need to know that what happens next. I have to mention that Matt Wilson is here to do an ace job on the colors like he does every time in The Wicked and the Divine. There was a really cool 80s vibe going on here. On the minus side, I was thrown by the homophobic slurs, even though it's just one character. Her friends call her out on it, and it's the 80s. But it just felt like a weird note to pretty much start the book. Her prejudice does come up in the story later on, but I do think it's always called out. But at the beginning it was still a bad surprise and it threw me a bit. I gave this one 2 stars. And the final thing that I read in June was Princess Jellyfish, Volume 1 of the 2-in-1 omnibuses, and this is by Akiko Higashimura. And it tells of Tsukimi, who is a jellyfish fanatic, and she lives in a house in Tokyo together with a bunch of other geeky women. But then by accident she befriends this beautiful princess who just happens to be a guy. Now I watched the anime before and I really loved it, so I was really excited that this manga was translated into English now. I love seeing representation of geeky women, and most importantly different kinds of geeky women with different personalities and different interests. One of the women is into trains, one of them is into Japanese dolls and kimonos, and so on. They are flawed characters who also have prejudices of their own, especially against cool kids, fashionable people, most likely because they were either bullied in school by them or that they have just learned that those sort of people look down on them or laugh at them. Meanwhile, they also instinctively look down on those sort of people in self-preservation. And I love seeing such layered characters, especially women. The story is quite fun and lighthearted, but it also has some surprising levels and some quite emotional scenes. In the anime, there is one storyline that really bothers me, and it is just getting started in this book, so it didn't take away too much of my enjoyment, but I know it is coming. I'm really looking forward to the second volume, despite that storyline. If you want something that makes you laugh, that is cute and heartwarming, and has a bunch of passionate geeks, then I recommend this one. I ended up giving it 4 stars, even though I was quite close to giving it 5. So that was my June wrap-up. Let's hope it doesn't take me this long to do my July wrap-up. But I hope you had a good reading month, whether it was June or July. And I'll see you all later.